Okay, well, I think it's time to start. Let me introduce what we're doing here today, and we'll get started with Scott and Michael. Scott is a founding member of the Crowdfunding Professionals Association and is currently serving his fourth term as president and chairman of the board of directors. Scott is also a managing director at National Commonwealth Group, an Ohio-based 501c3 focused on economic development initiatives, currently trained on the restoration of Puerto Rico's sovereignty via food and energy independence and community development through novel complementary currency and liquidity initiatives. Scott is active in venture communities, both local and abroad, and is an active speaker with frequent appearances in China, India, Australia, and Europe, maintaining an active network of leading foreign alternative finance bodies with colleagues in over 20 countries. Michael Sauvante brings over 40 years of experience in founding and running more than half a dozen companies and nonprofit organizations. He is an expert in new venture creation and also within mature companies, including pioneering work at HP Labs, and has long been a progressive thinker in the field of sustainability, corporate social and environmental behavior, and corporate responsibility. Michael has a deep understanding of general corporate law, corporate securities law, banking and tax law, and more. Michael and Scott have been working together for the past 6 years, and today we're going to focus on their work in Puerto Rico using alternative currencies as part of the restructuring efforts they're leading. So, Scott, why don't you take it away?
Well, thanks, Devin. Appreciate the intro. Kind and longer than needed be, but good to have it out there. So, yeah, as you described, Michael and I met shortly after the founding of the CfPA. We're introduced by a common colleague, an attorney here in Ohio, and it's just been a real meeting of the minds ever since. I'm very proud and fortunate to consider him my mentor in this space, as his experience in corporate responsibility, impact investment, sustainability for small and medium-sized enterprises has really led more into an overarching economic development platform that I think is really going to open people's eyes as to how modern monetary theory applies in the real world, how cryptocurrencies and complementary currencies can coexist, and how we can utilize these new pieces of fintech and alternative finance to bolster economies in crisis, as we see is happening in Puerto Rico since the devastation of the hurricanes, and quite frankly, long before that with mismanagement of money from government on down. So Michael can obviously get more into that as well, but I'm very happy to be working with him for so long, and feel that we're getting very close to making some impactful work possible in Puerto Rico and other districts in the country. So.
Michael, how would you take this on?
Well, let me first skip back briefly in history here and say that National Commonwealth Group is sort of a small think tank that actually got triggered a decade ago when another one of our colleagues and I, Vari, started working on community economic development issues, researching issues related to funding of small and medium-sized enterprises through both capital formation and credit facilitation, and all the kinds of barriers and problems they encounter. We kept looking for ways to be able to break through that to, create some sort of systemic solution set. And as Scott mentioned, about 6 years ago, he teamed up with us, and we continue to explore. And he actually is the one who reached out to me several years ago and said, hey, did you hear about this ICO that raised $153 million in 3 hours? And I said, what? Well, that triggered our diving deep into looking into currencies, both crypto and regular currencies, even including paper currencies, etc., the history of them. And in the process, we discovered that even though there's like roughly 5,000 of them worldwide active at any one time, right now that's the case, that only a very small number of them seem to produce really significant impacts on the local economies in a very positive way. And so the big question mark to us is, well, what's different about those particular examples? Because, you know, everybody that's on this webinar right now has been exposed to the idea of, you know, the cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth, and Libra, et cetera. But, you know, you don't hear a lot about how can those actually be used to fundamentally bootstrap up and lift up a depressed economy. So there were examples where that did happen. So what did they do? And I'll just quickly highlight the key thing that we discovered, and in turn refer people that if you look on the Facebook link for this program, that I've posted some links in the discussion area. And the first one is an article we wrote about money itself. And a lot of what I'm talking about right now is described in there. And the key thing that we discovered was unique about those particular places, and I'll give one example. There was a place in the middle of the Depression in Austria that when they did this, they went from 30+% unemployment to 0 in weeks. So, you know, it's just, you know, totally unheard of. And so what was different, and the key that we discovered is the idea of the issuer spending the money into existence. Most of us know that if I want to buy Bitcoin, I have to give dollars or, you know, unos or euros or whatever, you know, to purchase them. But in the case of these outsized experiments, they actually just simply spent the money into existence. And that then led us to developing an entire economic development ecosystem around that idea that actually lacked for a name for most of its first year, until something came along that triggered us saying, oh, well, we have to put a label on ours to distinguish. And that was back in December when the Green New Deal hit the airwaves. We looked at what they were saying that Green New Deal was all about, which was both economic, environmental, and social in combination, not just environmental. And we looked at our program and said, ours is just basically a smaller version of that within one region. And so we came up with the name of Sustainable Communities Framework, or SCF. And the website that we've set up for that is, again, one of the things that I've got the links in that Facebook
page.
Yeah, by the way, the second link that's in there are those historic examples. It's an article called Complementary Currencies in Use. And so if you want to read about some of those historical examples, those are described there. And then our website describes this. And when we came up with this framework, we then looked around and said, you know, where would be a good place to go and demonstrate that this is a viable concept? And Puerto Rico stood out as the poster child for some of the worst, you know, distressed economy in the world. And so we started working with folks down there in Puerto Rico to develop this. And so there's several links there, again, in that Facebook posting that describe the elements of this program and where we're starting, because it's the old expression, like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I mean, it's a big concept, but it's actually very doable in terms of on a certain sequential basis. And that if anybody's interested, they can ask us and we will provide them with further information about that. But let me finish with this one point, and that was, along the way, we learned that the federal government, in response to the hurricanes that hit, you know, the Caribbean and the you know, Gulf, you know, et cetera, states, that back in 2018, they authorized about $600 million for disaster relief for all the places that were impacted by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And the worst hit was Puerto Rico. So they allocated almost a third of that money for that to be administered under the Department of Commerce in the Economic Development Administration. And that I would like to point everybody to the last link in that Facebook posting I put up there, because our federal government has woefully failed the people of Puerto Rico in that the office responsible for allocating the funds for the Puerto Rico disaster relief they have only issued about 10% of them, whereas all the other offices responsible for Florida, Houston, South Carolina, et cetera, they've all spent about 50% of the money that they were supposed to allocate. So I'd like to direct people to that, and for them to read the details, contact their congressperson or whomever to say, hey, we need to help the people in Puerto Rico. So that's kind of a race through. I wanted to leave plenty of time here to explore any of these particular topics, and then especially to open up into dialogue.
Yeah, Scott, I wonder if you would tackle a question for us that I think is kind of foundational. How does the U.S. dollar impact, hurt, harm, help with the Puerto Rican economic recovery or its overall economic situation?
Well, it's a pretty complex question, and it goes back to what the nature is of the territory itself, and even referring to it to a territory is somewhat of controversy. On the island, you'll find people, when we were there, Michael and I were there a couple of months ago and had a chance to meet with the people and spend a good amount of time understanding how they feel about their position vis-a-vis the government's representation of the people there. And I think it's far more common to have people assume that it feels more like a colony than it does a territory, and certainly not a state. The fact that Puerto Rico has its ability to govern itself with the governor and with the representative in Washington is great, but it doesn't feel so great when you talk about how much debt has been saddled onto the island. And by virtue of a few people in the government, everybody there now bears the brunt of this debt. And frankly, the fact that they're a territory even prohibits them from effectively filing their own bankruptcy, which is a condition in business that every company in the U.S. and every state in the U.S. or every city in the U.S. has the opportunity to file. And that is a bone of contention as well. So as far as the money goes, Devin, I think it's really about how the aid is distributed and applied. And to date, we've seen gross corruption and failure of the delivery of those dollars, not even mentioning the amount, the 90% of the amount that was allotted in 2017 after the hurricanes, specifically for the EDA to administer to the regions affected by hurricanes Irma and others. So it's a real travesty, and it's something that we believe that although I think a lot of the parties would say, hey, we can solve all this with private capital, we can solve this with private industry, we don't need government to be doing handouts. Well, that in itself is also a bit of a bone of contention, because of the small businesses there that could receive, most aren't going to be on the radar, whereas the big businesses that are there obviously have plenty of access to capital. And when you have a society, a culture, and all of its members, all of the American citizens that live there have been affected by these downturns in the economy and then by a natural disaster, it's impossible to imagine that they would have enough collateral sufficient to qualify for debt. So that's really where we came in, is to offer a proven path to sovereignty, at least the feeling, the dignity that comes with not relying on handouts from a foreign government that is truly not your own government, as it would if it were a state. And by doing so, we realized that complementary currencies, not cryptocurrencies, but complementary currencies, buy local campaigns, alternative currencies, there's lots of other names for this. It's not a speculative commodity. It's not a securitized asset. It is simply a way for people to say, I'm going to help you if you help me, and here's how we do it. You can't carry around a bucket of chickens and trade them for pigs all day. So we have to have a currency to do that. And that is something that's been around for a long, long time. And Michael's research has been incredibly adept at exploring and exploiting those patterns and those histories and those stories of economies that have been raised up by a local currency. So.
Scott, if I may, there's an interesting tidbit. In fact, pre-Maria, it was estimated there was somewhere around 44,000 small businesses on the island, which are the economic backbone of the island. Post-Maria, it's now estimated there's only about 36,000 surviving. So they lost about 8,000 small businesses as a result of the hurricane. And so a lot of our whole sustainable communities framework is centered around going in and directly providing nurturing and support of the small and medium-sized enterprises in ways that directly make them more profitable. And we do so that goes beyond the typical, Scott used the term buy local campaigns, that there's lots of times where a community will issue a local currency to encourage people just to spend their money with their local merchants, locally owned merchants. And that has a certain benefit to those merchants, but we have ways of actually increasing their profit beyond just driving more customers to them. So it's all part of our whole focus with this Sustainable Communities Framework, and that complementary currency enables that.
Yeah, and much of the research that you'll find in the SCF website goes to illustrate the cultures that have had survival as a result of initiatives like ours. This is really far older than the current monetary system that the world seems to impress on developing economies, and something that we really need to bring more awareness to, whether it's been manually or artificially snuffed out of our textbooks in school is another question. But I'm certain that there's a lot of conspiracists that would agree that that certainly is the case. But people's understanding of what money is really critical to the understanding of how a local currency can go to bolster an economy to resiliency and sustainability as well.
Michael, you suggested that the key strategy to have impact, a positive economic impact, is to spend the currency into existence.
Yes.
Tell us how you do that.
Well, let me go back and give some of those historical examples, probably the most dramatic one was actually a period of about 250 years back in what's called the Central Middle Ages, and everybody's well aware of the significant number of cathedrals that are throughout Western Europe. And that most people know they're pretty old, but don't know any of the background to them. It turns out that the communities are the ones who actually issued their own currency and paid the architects, the stonemasons, etc. So they did the work and they just simply issued them the money. It didn't come from, again, swapping out the king's currency or whatever. It was the community created its own money, hired these people to do that work, and that then basically primed the pump of continuously pumping new money into the economy, producing widespread prosperity in that time frame. That Complementary Currencies in Use document describes this and gives some chapters to have people to read to get a better feel for this. But that was the one that really stood out to us. So there's the example, Devin, of the idea of the issuer spending it directly. So in our case today, we're going to be making use of one of the most widely used complementary currency banking systems in the world called Cyclos, CYCLOS.org. And that is a digital banking system where essentially where we have the circumstances where we want to spend money into existence, we will essentially on a keyboard just to simply create those currencies and issue them to the recipient. Okay, and it's all part of what's baked into it. In other cases, we will do the other things of, say, like selling unos, which is the name of the currency we got down there, $4, etc. Okay. Say again, Scott. He broke up.
Yeah, Scott's got a bad connection this morning where he struggled with that the whole time, which is a shame. But
did that answer your question, Devin?
Yeah, that was a great answer. I wonder, Michael, if you just take a minute and describe in more detail. I think you think of your operation as a think, do, tank. Take a minute and tell us about the do part. What are you doing in Puerto Rico now to bring this about?
Well, essentially, that when you say the typical think tank, that's more sort of a stand back observer that doesn't interfere with the experiments that they're measuring and tracking, et cetera. Whereas our economic think do tank, which we're establishing there in Puerto Rico, is going to have an active feedback loop that all of what we're doing right now is in many cases theory, even though it's built on historical examples. We've modernized it, so there is no direct examples out there of what we're doing. So we're going to try and experiment with these things, and we've engaged some very significant academics and researchers to team with us to record and track and observe, et cetera, and write about and analyze the results that come out of that, and for all of us to then say, okay, did this work? Did that work? If it didn't, how can we improve on it? And so there's where the do part is. So the researchers actually directly involved in our exploring these different avenues that we're going to try and do under this program, and to observe them. That rarely is that done, where you're introducing some new system and you've got the chroniclers right there alongside of you. So that's the think do aspect of it.
Excellent. Well, I want to invite all of our audience members to submit questions now to Michael and Scott, so we can get them to answer them before we wrap up. We'll be wrapping up in about 10 minutes. So we've got 10 minutes for Q&A now. So feel free to submit questions. I think there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, similarly on a phone, there is a button for you to submit a question. And Scott and Michael will be happy to answer those. Scott, I know you've been to Puerto Rico a number of times as you've gone through this process. I expect, and not having been there, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you see, give us a sense of what's on the ground there. But the images we see of devastation from the hurricane a couple of years ago probably are an incomplete picture, right? There are beautiful beaches and there are modern buildings. Scott, take us through what's on the ground and the attitude of the people. Give us a sense of how they are struggling, thriving. What are the opportunities they see? Give us a sense.
Sure. You have any trouble hearing me now?
We're good. You're good.
Okay, good. Well, I would say that it's actually a quite in-depth question, Devin, because the first thing that I like to do when I visit a new location, happier, I said, I just want to, see what life is really like. So I took it upon myself on my last trip to Puerto Rico to actually walk from the airport, which if you've been to San Juan, it's not the most convenient airport to walk into the city from, but it was fun. And I got to actually see where people go, what they do. And then I walked all the way from where the airport meets, where the hotels and stuff begin on the beach, all the way into town where we were staying. And so that took about 2.5 hours. And I got a feel for where the devastation actually is as opposed to what the cameras show. So it's a lot more pervasive than you would assume, having just looked at pictures of the city. Of course, the old city of San Juan looks beautiful from any angle, and it's also higher elevation, so it avoided a lot of the brunt of the storms that the lower lying lands did, which most of the city of San Juan is quite lower land. So I think the devastation in the city is substantial, but in the country it's even worse, and that's where the cameras never go. And that's an issue that, we have to face. Can you still hear me? Because I saw that.
Yeah. We turned off your camera so we could.
Okay. Great. Perfect. So, I think that when it comes to how do we, resuscitate this economy without a terrific partner in the governor's mansion or in the White House, you have to do it by bringing the underbanked and the unbanked into the economy for the first time. And this isn't something that we're just seeing in Puerto Rico. This is a common theme with developing nations and economies in crisis worldwide. So to do that, this is where Michael mentioned our partners in Cyclos, which is a nonprofit as well. And having had 20 years experience building banking systems, not just for communities and corporations, but for economies and municipalities, I think that it is an amazing opportunity to bring people into a modern economy, and yet do so without actually saddling them with debt and credit that would normally be associated with bringing them into the banking economy through paths that we've seen in other developing economies, such as microloans and in other forms of initial commerce for small scale entrepreneurs and small businesses. So we're seeing that. And the way to do that is obviously with a local currency. You can inspire people to trade services, perhaps more than goods, because anything that's imported from off the island is going to require US dollars or other currencies to purchase. So most of this starts out initially with service. And we see that provides great opportunities and ways to bolster the energy picture in Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico faces both food and energy independence only if they're allowed to grow, build, and manage their own resources appropriately. And right now, their resources are, of course, extracted out and then shipped back in the forms of diesel fuel, which powers most of the generators in the island. So that's changing. We're seeing some movement on that. We did get EDA recently did announce that they granted some monies to a pilot project for solar panels in Culebra. which is a neighboring island to Puerto Rico. So we'll see how that goes, and we're hopeful that it generates the kind of attention that the people need systemically throughout the island. But it's a long slog from where they are now.
Yeah, we just got a great question. Michael, why don't you tackle this one? But the question is, sorry, I might have missed the point of using alternative currencies instead of traditional currencies. Since fiat such as USD is so popular and is accepted pretty much worldwide, why do they really need alternative currencies? Great fundamental question. Michael, what's your take?
Well, if I may, two responses to that. One, I'm going to encourage them to go back again and read that article about money. That's the first link in my posting on the Facebook page.
Quick pause, Michael. The Facebook page is facebook.com/crowdfunding professional association. That's where you can find all the links that Michael's talking about.
Okay, yeah. And so, that article will explain that essentially the fiat currency system, US dollars, euros, etc., actually all come from the banking system, and they put in motion certain things that we're starting to see the consequences of. The haves and have-nots, wealth disparity, et cetera, is a fundamental component of how that system is structured. The complementary currency concept allows us to break out of the constraints of those systems and allows us to be able to do things self-initiated that we can't do under the other old economic system. I mean, if the other economic system was good, we would not have the poverty and problems that we do around the world. And it's fundamental weaknesses that the complementary currency program can basically offset and fix. So that was the first part of your question. I didn't quite catch Devin, the other.
So I think the fundamental question is, why do we really need alternative currencies?
Yeah. And if I may, the second thing is I just posted another link in that Facebook page to an article, another document that I think is probably one of the most important ones to read to get an understanding of the role of complementary currencies and how I made a claim a few minutes ago of how we actually improve the profitability of the individual small businesses. That document describes that program. It describes it in geared towards those merchants, saying, here's what we can do for you. Well, if you understand what we're telling them we can do for them, then you understand how the complementary currency plays such a vital role in that whole process.
I could probably take a little
Scott,
stab
go
at
ahead.
that, Devin, as well. And so the difference between a fiat currency, one that is artificially limited in supply, right, is a problem because the funnel for which that currency is distributed is bottlenecked at the government and at the Fed.
Yes.
So what we have is a system where if you don't borrow it, you're not going to have access to it. If you don't have credit worthiness, you're not going to be able to borrow it. And what we see after a devastating event like what Puerto Rico has gone through, frankly, for the last 50 years, ever since I've been around, we've had cycles of corruption and collapse. You don't have credit worthiness by and large on the island. So it leaves most people out of it, unless you're a giant corp, which we've seen with Big Ag, which we've seen with Big Energy, which we've seen with Big Pharma on the island of Puerto Rico. You simply don't have access to the capital that's required to get you off the ground. On top of that, we could probably go into education and other issues. But as it relates to the currencies themselves, a complementary currency being indigenous to the people, only spendable on the island, among the people of the island, and tourists who come. And if they want to spend it and buy it and sell it and leave it, that's up to them as well. But being that it's only there, and being that this really comes down to the core difference between fiat and modern monetary theory, which says really there is no issue with inflation, even if we put more capital into the marketplace, until we don't have the resources and capacity to process that money. And in the case of the people of Puerto Rico, they're incredibly resilient, brilliant, and had a culture long before we decided to colonize them. So it's really just a matter of giving them back their dignity, giving them the tools to do so. And with the power of the digital banking system that we have, it's actually possible now, where it would have been a bit more friction and labor to do so before because of the cost of printing paper currency and the risk of counterfeit in that particular space, which we've seen in other examples.
Scott, if I may, one summary statement, because we're about out of time here. In the old system, it takes money to make money. Under our system, you can create the money. You don't have to have the money in advance. And that's a fundamental dynamic shift that has all kinds of Archimedes lever and ramifications to it.
So Michael, how is the currency, the new currency, being used today, right now in Puerto Rico? Give us a use case.
We have not, we're in the process of about to launch it down there. So I can't say how is it being used, that we're laying the foundations, bringing in the engaged parties, et cetera. So we have not turned on the system yet.
Excellent. Well, it looks like with appropriate timing, Scott's connection failed. But Scott and Michael, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to be with us. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. We've had some great discussion, and we're thrilled to have you all here with us today. And thank you very much for taking the time.
Scott said he's actually back.
Yeah, he's back. I'm gonna make him a panelist so we can wave goodbye to him. Again, Scott, thank you very much for being with us. Michael, thank you. You can learn more about the Crowdfund Professionals Association on the Facebook page, facebook.com/Crowdfund Professionals Association, and also on our website. So check us out and learn more, and we'd love to have you as a member. Take care now.
Thank you, Devin. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. I'm real.